Springheel Jack is an entity in English folklore of the Victorian era. The first claimed sighting of Springheel Jack was in 1837. Later sightings were reported all over the United Kingdom and were especially prevalent in suburban London, the Midlands and Scotland. There are many theories about the nature and identity of Springheel Jack. This urban legend was very popular in its time, due to the tales of his bizarre appearance and ability to make extraordinary leaps, to the point that he became the topic of several works of fiction. Springheel Jack was described by people who claimed to have seen him as having a terrifying and frightful appearance, with diabolical physiognomy, clawed hands, and eyes that resembled red balls of fire. One report claimed that, beneath a black cloak, he wore a helmet and a tight-fitting white garment like an oilskin. Many stories also mention a devil-like aspect. Others said he was tall and thin, with the appearance of a gentleman. Several reports mention that he could breathe out blue and white flames, and that he wore sharp metallic claws at his fingertips. At least 2 people claimed that he was able to speak comprehensible English. The first alleged sightings of Springheel Jack were made in London in 1837, and the last reported sighting is said in most of the secondary literature to have been made in Liverpool in 1904. According to much later accounts, in October 1837 a girl by the name of Mary Stevens was walking to Lavender Hill, where she was working as a servant, after visiting her parents in Battersea. On her way through Clapham Common, a strange figure leapt at her from a dark alley. After immobilizing her with a tight grip of his arms, he began to kiss her face, while ripping her clothes and touching her flesh with his claws, which were, according to her deposition, cold and clammy as those of a corpse. In panic, the girl screamed, making the attacker quickly flee from the scene. The commotion brought several residents, who immediately launched a search for the aggressor, but he could not be found. The next day, the leaping character is said to have chosen a very different victim near Mary Stevens' home, inaugurating a method that would reappear in later reports. He jumped in the way of a passing carriage, causing the coachman to lose control, crash, and severely injure himself. Several witnesses claimed that he escaped by jumping over a 9 feet (2.7 meters) high wall while cackling with a high-pitched, ringing laughter. Gradually, the news of the strange character spread, and soon the press and the public gave him the name Springheel Jack. A few months after these first sightings, on January 9, 1838, the Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cowan, revealed at a public session held in the Mansion House an anonymous complaint that he had received several days earlier, which he had withheld in the hope of obtaining further information. The correspondent, who signed the letter, a resident of Peckham, wrote, "It appears that some individuals, of, as the writer believes, the highest ranks of life, have laid a wager with a mischievous and foolhardy companion, that he durst not take upon himself the task of visiting many of the villages near London in 3 different disguises, a ghost, a bear, and a devil, and moreover, that he will not enter a gentleman's gardens for the purpose of alarming the inmates of the house." The wager has, however, been accepted, and the unmanly villain has succeeded in depriving 7 ladies of their senses, 2 of whom are not likely to recover, but to become burdens to their families. At one house the man rang the bell, and on the servant coming to open door, this worse than brute stood in no less dreadful figure than a spectre clad most perfectly. The consequence was that the poor girl immediately swooned, and has never from that moment been in her senses. The affair has now been going on for some time, and, strange to say, the papers are still silent on the subject. The writer has reason to believe that they have the whole history at their finger ends, but, through interested motives, are induced to remain silent. Perhaps the best known of the alleged incidents involving Springheel Jack were the attacks on 2 teenage girls, Lucy Scales and Jane Alsop. The Alsop report was widely covered by the newspapers, including a piece in the Times, while fewer reports appeared in relation to the attack on Scales. The press coverage of these 2 attacks helped to raise the profile of Springheel Jack. Jane Alsop reported that on the night of February 19, 1838, she answered the door of her father's house to a man claiming to be a police officer, who told her to bring a light, claiming, "We have caught Spring-heeled Jack here in the lane." She brought the person a candle, and noticed that he wore a large cloak. The moment she had handed him the candle, however, he threw off the cloak and presented a most hideous and frightful appearance, vomiting blue and white flame from his mouth while his eyes resembled red balls of fire. Miss Alsop reported that he wore a large helmet and that his clothing, which appeared to be very tight-fitting, resembled white oilskin. Without saying a word he caught hold of her and began tearing her gown with his claws, which she was certain were of some metallic substance. She screamed for help, and managed to get away from him and ran towards the house. He caught her on the steps and tore her neck and arms with his claws. She was rescued by one of her sisters, after which her assailant fled. On February 28, 1838, 9 days after the attack on Miss Alsop, 18-year-old Lucy Scales and her sister were returning home after visiting their brother, a butcher who lived in a respectable part of Limehouse. Miss Scales stated in her deposition to the police that as she and her sister were passing along Green Dragon Alley, they observed a person standing in an angle of the passage. She was walking in front of her sister at the time, and just as she came up to the person, who was wearing a large cloak, he spurted a quantity of blue flame in her face, which deprived her of her sight, and so alarmed her, that she instantly dropped to the ground, and was seized with violent fits which continued for several hours. Her brother added that on the evening in question, he had heard the loud screams of one of his sisters moments after they had left his house, and on running up Green Dragon Alley he found his sister Lucy on the ground in a fit, with her sister attempting to hold and support her. She was taken home, and he then learned from his other sister what had happened. She described Lucy's assailant as being of tall, thin, and gentlemanly appearance, covered in a large cloak, and carrying a small lamp or bull's-eye lantern similar to those used by the police. The individual did not speak or did he try to lay hands on them, but instead walked quickly away. Every effort was made by the police to discover the author of these and similar outrages, and several persons were questioned, but were set free. The Times reported the alleged attack on Jane Alsop on March 2, 1838 under the heading, "The Late Outrage at Old Ford." This was followed with an account of the trial of one Thomas Milbank, who, immediately after the reported attack on Jane Alsop, had boasted in the Morgan's Arms that he was Spring-heeled Jack. He was arrested and tried at Lambeth Street Court. The arresting officer was James Leah, who had earlier arrested William Corder, the Red Barn murderer. Milbank had been wearing white overalls and a greatcoat, which he dropped outside the house, and the candle he dropped was also found. He escaped conviction only because Jane Alsop insisted her attacker had breathed fire, and Milbank admitted he could do no such thing. Most of the other accounts were written long after the date. Contemporary newspapers do not mention them. After these incidents, Spring-heeled Jack became one of the most popular characters of the period. His alleged exploits were reported in the newspapers, and became the subject of several penny dreadfuls and plays performed in the cheap theaters that abounded at the time. The devil was even renamed Spring-heeled Jack in some Punch and Judy shows, as recounted by Henry Mayhew in his London Labour and the London Labour and the London Poor. But, even as his fame was growing, reports of Spring-heeled Jack's appearances became less frequent if more widespread. In 1843, however, a wave of sightings swept the country again. A report from Northamptonshire described him as the very image of the devil himself, with horns and eyes of flame, and in East Anglia reports of attacks on drivers of mail coaches became common. In July 1847, a Spring-heeled Jack investigation in Teignmouth, Devon led to a Captain Finch being convicted of 2 charges of assault against women, during which he is said to have been disguised in a skin coat, which had the appearance of bullock's hide, skullcap, horns and mask. The legend was linked with the phenomenon of the Devil's Footprints, which appeared in Devon in February 1855. In the beginning of the 1870s, Spring-heeled Jack was reported again in several places distant from each other. In November 1872, the News of the World reported that Peckham was in a state of commotion owing to what is known as the Peckham ghost, a mysterious figure, quite alarming in appearance. The editorial pointed out that it was none other than Spring-heeled Jack, who terrified a past generation. Similar stories were published in the Illustrated Police News. In April and May 1873, it reported there were numerous sightings in Sheffield of the Park ghost, which locals also came to identify as Spring-heeled Jack. The vast urban legend built around Spring-heeled Jack influenced many aspects of Victorian life, especially in contemporary popular culture. For decades, especially in London, his name was equated with the bogeyman. As a means of scaring children into behaving by telling them if they were not good, Spring-heeled Jack would leap up and peer in at them through their bedroom windows, by night. However, it was in fictional entertainment where the legend of Spring-heeled Jack exerted the most extensive influence, owing to his allegedly extraordinary nature. 3 pamphlet publications, purportedly based on the real events, appeared almost immediately, during January and February 1838. They were not advertised as fiction, though they likely were at least partly so. The only known copies were reported to have perished when the British Library was hit during the Blitz, but their catalogue still lists the first one. The character was written into a number of penny dreadful stories during the latter half of the 19th century, initially as a villain and then in increasingly heroic roles. By the early 1900s he was being represented as a costumed, altruistic avenger of wrongs and protector of the innocent, effectively becoming a precursor to pulp fiction and then comic book superheroes.